Hi everyone, Season 9 is about to start and it's looking like quite the Spiritborn season. You might have seen the max roll tier lists on my video talking about those, but if you haven't, well, Spiritborn is at the top with not just one, but two, three, four different builds. So we have a lot of different stuff, and that is all thanks to the new Banazan Max Lateral unique pants that actually gives us a few very similar variations of the same build, but they do look and feel a bit different and have their own little perks and disadvantages. So I want to walk you through this, basically covering those four builds all at once because it's almost the same for all of them. There's a lot of copy pasta, so you can also try to switch between them if you want. It's a little bit like, for example, in Season 6 with the Kapaleke builds. What you see here right now is, for example, the Rake version, and there is also a Thrash, a Quill, and a Crushing Hand version. Technically, you can play this with pretty much just about anything on the Spiritborn, but they have more or less synergy with that. At least with those four skills, there is definitely a distinct reason to run each one of them for, you know, certain advantages and certain disadvantages that you want to deal with, or just to get a bit of a different feel if you want to switch it up a little bit. But for the most part, those are probably the four skills that work the best with this. We might discover more stuff. Technically, you could even do something like a Stinger build, for example, or whatever you want, because a lot of other builds on the Spiritborn are just not that powerful, but it wouldn't really make all too much sense compared to those that we have here. So the general idea of this build is that you stack Thorns with the unique pants, and that converts its Thorns into poison damage, which you then explode on targets with Noxious Resonance. So this naturally leads to a really insane AoE damage output. You can see here right now I'm cruising through a pit 110, and this is on a not very optimized character back on the PTR. Now the pants have been nerfed a little bit since then and so on, but we do definitely expect the Spiritborn to be at the number one of the charts basically for now. And well, this also means that because you have this very high AoE damage, you generally have no trouble progressing through these really high pits, but then the boss fights are a bit of a struggle. And so much so that at some point you just have to get ad bosses, you just have to do 10-minute boss fights or so, but we're talking about, you know, pits like 110, 120 or whatever, you know, up to like, I guess 100 plus or so. It should be not really such a big deal with fishing for bosses. For example, Torment 4 lair bosses are not going to be an issue at all, so they are way weaker than that, and you're just gonna blast through those in seconds. So while this is a Thorns build, it's actually more of a poison build because of the Noxious Resonance and making this really AoE focused. On top of that, it is also very difficult to build really strong defenses on this. The only variant that actually can do that is Crushing Hand, so especially hardcore people, I would recommend that, because you have built-in barriers from the skill itself, allowing you to free up one of the rune slots where you can build even more barriers or some other defenses, for example, and that's kind of like the only tech slot that you have, because otherwise it's kind of difficult to really get tanky on this. There are some ways that I will also explain that applies to all of those variants, but it's just kind of like a big loss if you try to be tanky otherwise. However, with good gear, you're going to get there and you will be able to tank stuff, even those highest tier pits. As I mentioned, most of the gear I had here on the PDR was nothing really incredible, so certainly very achievable items if you're trying to invest a little bit in your character. The other thing to know is also that you kind of need a few things to even get going here with those builds. They don't really work from level 1. First of all, you need the unique pants, so that is obviously a must, but there's also some other uniques that are really important to scale this up. One is Razor Plate, because naturally we want to have a lot of Thorns on this build so that we can scale the pants, and without the Razor Plate you're gonna just not really do a lot of damage basically. So I'm gonna try to get at least those two. And then there's also Loyalty's Mantle, and that is a bit more complicated. But effectively, this build, similar to many other, especially push builds on the Spiritborn in Season 9, will rely on Jaguar Hall double dipping. So what happens is that there are certain damage multipliers that can double dip on the damage done by the Jaguar Hall. So first, it counts the higher damage that you deal to the target with whatever you do, and then Jaguar Hall gets another multiplier. So that is unintended and could be fixed at any moment, but it's unlikely that this is going to happen during Season 9, I believe, because if they do that, then the Spiritborn is definitely going noticeably down, and this was reported a long time ago, and Blizzard hasn't done anything, so I don't really expect to see an adjustment in Season 9. but maybe more like in season 10. But it could happen, and something to keep in mind. If that happens, it's not going to be suddenly unplayable. It's still going to be pretty strong, but it's probably not going to be at the, #1 spot anymore, but maybe more like the range of like a top 10 build or so. So solid enough, I guess, so you don't have to worry to, suddenly not be able to do like a pit 100 anymore or something like that. But the reason why I'm explaining all of this is the loyalties mantle, which actually improves this Jaguar Hall like potency with the Jaguar combo in the Spirit Hall choice. So this is a common thing that we have in many builds now on the Spiritborn. And for that, we also go for certain damage modifiers, or we just have them in the build anyway, and they get even stronger. One of them are the Mystic Circles from the Plains Power aspect. So Plains Power is a huge damage modifier, and that also double dips into the Jaguar Hall. So when you are standing in those circles, they give you something like a ×15, ×20 damage multiplier. So effectively, you don't do damage without those Mystic Circles. So this is something to keep in mind, at least when it comes to like higher tier pits. And for example, boss fights where you might have to dodge around a little bit or something, you have to try to play around those Mystic Circles. For Torment 4 farming, you don't really care, you have more than enough damage, so it's definitely doable without that, but you still keep them in the build, for example, for the bosses. Another important damage modifier is the Quax rune. Again, this is something that goes into many builds by default, including this one, but this is also one of those that double dips. So you don't get double damage, you get quadruple damage when it procs, and you try to achieve that basically non-stop. But the way to do this, the best way possible in most of those setups, is with the Ahu rune. So this means that, for example, on a boss fight, you will actually not trigger this at all until the boss reaches 80%. So you have kind of like a very scuffed start to the boss fight until you reach 80%, and then suddenly the boss starts melting pretty fast because of that. So this is also something to keep in mind. But there is one of those variants, which is Thrash, which can easily trigger Quax in other ways with the Moni rune. And in that case, you actually have the effect very consistently all the time, and you don't have this weird gap at the start. Another thing worth noting is also the cooldown management of those different versions here. So we have two that are based on Jaguar skills, which actually have a very easy time resetting the cooldowns. In particular, the Hunter is very important. This is our ultimate ability, and we want to proc this basically all the time. It produces many hits. It gives us a bunch of buffs from the passives on the tree, and you just kind of want to press that like every few seconds, basically. So Rake cannot reset the easiest because Rake has a built-in cooldown recovery effect here on the skill itself. So this has the easiest time managing cooldowns. So if you don't want to think about cooldowns, or especially when it got started and you don't really have great gear just yet, or the wrong tempers, then Rake is a pretty good option here. The other advantage of Rake is also that it actually triggers the pants twice. This is unique to Rake because of the Wild Claws aspect. This is something that works as like a second skill cast, and actually allows you to trigger a lot of effects twice, including those pants, which is something very special, and the only reason why Rake is actually going to be so good. So you have, for example, less other triggers, for example the Jaguar main hall, but you have double the amount of Balazan procs, plus very easy cooldown management, which is the thing here about Rake. For example, Crushing Hand, you have the advantage of the extra barriers, so you're just tanky, and you can also free up one of your rune slots to get even tankier, or maybe some more damage, depending on what you're going for. But yeah, if you want to be the tankiest version of Balazan, then this is the way. Then we have the Quill, which is kind of like the best single target option, but it does have a bit of problems with resetting cooldowns, in particular, again, the Hunter. So the way that this is done on this build, we don't have the built-in cooldown from the skill. We use the Wildfire Glyph. So Wildfire Glyph, when you deal fire damage, you can get cooldown resets. And well, we have fire damage coming from two sources here, which is Ravager. So every time we attack, we proc Ravager on like a lot of targets, and this can give us the Wildfire procs. So in a large pull, you actually reset cooldowns that way, or even easier, Hunter resets itself thanks to hitting a large pull many times, and it also produces its own lucky hit. So in AoE pulls, you instantly reset your Hunter just with the Wildfire Glyph, which actually goes into some of those setups, but for example, on a single target, there is a little bit of downtime potentially. The same applies to, for example, the Crushing Hand, but well, Rake doesn't have any issues. And also here with Thrash, we generally don't really have a lot of issues with the Hunter cooldown as well. So now that I explained the overall setup and the pros and cons of those different versions that we have here, let's jump into some more details of how this is actually set up. So I did talk about the combo of the 3 unique items. In the case of Thrash, we also have, for example, a Fist of Fate here to just have another damage multiplier, and Lucky Hit is pretty useful. It also makes that vulnerable and so on. So that is kind of nice. But yeah, overall, we're just trying to scale generic damage multipliers. In particular, the Plains Power for the Mystic Circles. And then we have Conceited, we have Vehement Brawler, and then usually one skill-specific aspect here. So we have Rebounding for the Quill. We have the Unrelenting for the Crushing Hand. It's basically just about getting more hits in, getting more lucky hits, and getting more Jaguar Hall procs. The number of attacks is really important because the more you attack, not only do you proc your pants more, but you also proc the Jaguar Hall more. So this means you kind of double dip on attack speed. It makes this stat really valuable, or in general, just trying to get more hits in with any means possible. On Rake, we have the Wild Claws aspect, which is not only more hits, but less than the others, but it also double procs the pants. So you have more raw damage and less Jaguar Hall reliance, basically. And Thrash is kind of like an in-between of the others. It doesn't have like a skill-specific aspect. Instead, we don't even go for Star of Skies later. We just have another normal ring here where we have Rapid, and then we have the Fist of Fate that I mentioned. So with that out of the way, I'm just going to focus on the Quill version now to not jump between the setups all the time, so we get a bit of an understanding of what everything else is about here. So let's go through the skill tree. Basically, what you need to know is we always group up enemies with Vortex. So you just kind of like walk into a pack, try to get a large number of enemies all at once, because the more enemies you have, the more damage you do. You have kind of like insane AoE scaling thanks to Noxious Resonance, because the more targets you hit, the more damage you deal. So this is pretty important. Vortex and also Vortex size tempers, for example, on our gear. The Ravager here, so to give a bit of an insight on that, it's mostly there to get even more hits on the target. So what happens is that the more times you hit per second, the more often you proc Jaguar main hall, giving you this insane damage proc. And then we go for Replenishing Ravager. So now we want to have a source of healing in our build to stack this up. So every time you heal in any form, from regeneration, from lucky hit, chance to heal, or for example from the Hunter and Sustenance passive here, you get a stack of Ravager. And then every time you hit an elite or a boss, it will consume those stacks to get an extra hit in. So this gives us even more hits, even more Jaguar procs. It doesn't proc the Balazan pants by itself, but it helps you out with just more DPS through more procs. So this is why this is included. In some Speedfire variants, however, we actually do this. We go to Measured Ravager, at least for the core skill variants of this, just so you can like fly through the maps a bit more easier. So when you do like Torment 4 content or lower pits or something like that, you don't really need this here, and you just want to go fast, and you can actually speed farm pretty quickly. And this is like some of the top farming builds in the game as well, especially thanks to Measured Ravager. You just kind of fly from pack to pack with this. Then we have Toxic Skin, which is not actually useful by itself. You can press it to become unhindered, but you kind of have that anyway from the season powers. And it does a little bit of poison damage, but it's pretty trivial compared to the other output we have. But what we really want is Replenishing Toxic Skin. This doubles our Thorns damage, including the Balazan pants. Even though this is a poison dot that comes out of it, it does actually scale. So you want to have this on your bar. You don't actually really want to press this though. So you can do this, especially for pit pushing, where you can get an extra source of dots on a target and then potentially stack Tyrant Bane, a Horadric Jewel. But other than that, you kind of just keep it passively. Here is Armored Hide. Armored Hide is also a staple for Spiritborn. So this gives us Resolve. So Resolve is pretty important. It gives us 20% damage reduction for a hit that you take. And I think you can only lose like 1 Resolve a second or so. So as long as you press this once in a while, you are generally fine. And this is a pretty good defensive tool, on top of also giving you Unstoppable and a bit of extra Thorns here. So this also scales our poisons. And you also get damage reduction when you block, and you have 100% block chance when this is up. So it is a pretty powerful defense. And with the Resolve, you also get some offensive buffs thanks to the Colossal Glyph that we have on Paragons. And lastly, the Hunter, our ultimate. So this is just also a staple for Spiritborn. We move around, we get a lot of ferocity, you get actually more ferocity than we can normally have, which also scales, for example, the attack speed. That's really relevant, and it scales the Plains power aspect. That is important. And we also deal extra damage against low HP enemies or we can even execute them. So for bosses, this is nerfed now to 50%. It's a pretty important damage buff towards the later stages of a fight, and otherwise it just helps you to, for example, jump on top of an elite that is already damaged, and you can just finish it off. You generally want to press the hunter every few seconds because of resolution. You get a damage buff here, and also supremacy. So these are pretty important passives here. Supremacy can stack up to 30 times, so it can get a 90% damage bonus here from having 3 ranks and 30 stacks. And resolution is another 30% on the boss, or 15% otherwise. Another neat thing about pressing ultimate often is intricacy. So this actually resets your last used skill and allows you to cast it for free a few times. So for example, in a pit run, you would usually try to trigger this on Vortex. So you run into a pack, you press Vortex, and then you press Hunter, so that it resets the last used skill, which is Vortex. And then you can cast it a few more times. And then you run to the next pack and you press Vortex, Hunter, and then you maybe Hunter again, depending on how long the fight lasts. But you generally try to get the important skill in that moment as the last used skill before your ultimate. And then, for example, on the boss fight, where you don't really care about Vortex anymore, you can do the same thing with Armored Hide. So you can very easily keep up permanent Armored Hide on the boss fight, for example. Or, maybe here and there you want to reset your Ravager or something like that. You can actually kind of like choose which cooldown to reset. Now let's talk about stat priorities and the gear a little bit more. So we do try to stack a lot of life here because, as I mentioned earlier, it's kind of tough to really scale defenses here. Like, everything is unique. We can't really put a defensive aspect because we're going to lose a lot of damage and there's not really that many great options. So you kind of just try to deal with it through stacking life. So I have like GA life on many slots. I would really recommend to not underestimate life rolls. Other than that, we need a few kind of key roles here on any of those setups. So one of them is the chance to restore primary resource. That usually goes on a weapon. One roll, doesn't matter the value, will insta-fill your resource whenever it triggers. This is important either to just fuel the whole core skill spam, but it also helps, for example, with reactive ooze here from the season power. But more importantly, we trigger the Quack's rune quite often, which consumes all of our resources. And in that case, you want to try to restore that very fast so they can actually keep attacking. So this is why we have this. We also have the lucky hit chance to heal that we just throw in. It doesn't matter how high that value is, but again, as I mentioned, replenishing Ravager is actually pretty helpful. And depending on which setup exactly you're playing, this can actually lead to a lot of extra hits thanks to this heal effect here. And for the builds that don't have built-in vulnerable like Quill, so basically the other 3 variants here, they also go for a chance to make enemies vulnerable roll here with like a hit, for example, on the glove. So they get this effect as well. The rest of the gear is mostly about stacking attack speed wherever you can. You don't care about stuff like core skill ranks. Your core skill is not doing the damage. It's all coming from the pants. You don't even put like 5 points in there on the tree. We have 1 point and, we grab some useful utility and that's it. So you want attack speed, you want life. We want those, 2 or 3 specific lucky hit procs, and then it's just capping res and armor basically. So you just try to get whatever you can, and once you have like endgame gear, you should be fine. An ideal amulet looks like this roughly. So you want potent ranks if you can, because that is the strongest passive on the Spiritborn. It's 10% per point after stacking it up, which you do very easily, especially on boss fights, and this just helps you out the most there. So it kind of closes the gap slightly between boss damage and AoE, and that is really helpful. Other than that, percent dex is really good, or for example, if you're earlier in your progression, you can also just throw a percent armor roll here, just to kind of cap out more easily, and then, maybe focus more on the rest rolls on your gear. And you have other useful passives. There's Apex, Unrestrained Power, a bunch of other stuff that you can put here that is also not bad. And for our tempers, Mystic Circle potency is very important. This kind of supercharges the Plains power aspect. That is usually something like a 10% buff on a two-handed weapon, and this goes all the way to 25% per ferocity stack, which you have 13 of. And yeah, it's like a ×3, ×4 or so, and then double dips into the Jaguar Hull. So it gets pretty wild once you have those Mystic Circle tempers. And especially if you start masterworking your gear, this then multiplies even further. We also want to have a bit of size tempers. So in the case of Crushing Hand, you put Crushing Hand size. In the case of Thrash, we put a Thrash size, and so on. The only skill that doesn't have that is Quill. And instead, we also just go for 2 Vortex or 1 Vortex size tempers as well. So you want to have that so you can pull in the entire screen, which just makes farming a lot more smooth. and pushing a lot better. And lastly, Hunter cooldown is pretty important because, as I mentioned, you want to cast it all the time for all of those buffs. So you also put those tempers here on the neck, for example, and on the ring. And for example, early on, you can even do triple Hunter cooldown if you want. So this also makes it easier in like the earlier game versions of these, especially if we don't have masterworks and so on yet, then you can still get there. Lastly, our Paragon. So this looks pretty much the same for all of these builds. One thing to note here is that I tried this. Bitter Medicine does not actually work for this. Otherwise, this would be a very nice Paragon board to use because it would be very easy to stack this up and get a 40% damage multi. But unfortunately, it does not interact with the Balazan pants. So we have Spiny Skin. So you want to press a cooldown at least every 5 seconds. So you get this Thorns buff. We have Sapping, this is Vigor, Regeneration, and a 30% buff pretty easily just by spamming our stuff. Convergence, again, a pretty easy 30% damage buff, and we kind of like naturally stack this. And we have Viscous Shield, which is also a pretty important damage multiplier because, again, that also double dips into the Jaguar main hall. So you want to try to keep your barriers high, which is usually done with the Q rune. So we have that, for example, here in the Quill build, POC Q, for example, to trigger our barriers from Earthen Bulwark. And then we also have the seasonal power here, the Bottled Wind. So we trigger that every around 5 seconds with the Disintegrate Beam or yeah, something like that, depending on when we press our buttons here. And then we get a 50% barrier. So those together can actually completely max out your barrier. There's also Auspicious, which especially, for example, for speed farming, makes it very easy to keep up the barriers and you should not have any trouble. And then Viscous Shield gives you a nice damage buff. As for the glyphs, one that's important is Ritual. This is more Mystic Circle potency, also has pretty neat secondary bonus, for example, to give some damage reduction. We have Colossal, and even though the damage doesn't come from the skill, and we don't even have necessarily a Gorilla skill that we deal damage with, we mostly want this for the Resolve, because this is also a pretty important multiplier that double dips into the Jaguar Hall. This is why we run this. It also has a legendary bonus that's useful. Then we have Wildfire, or potentially another glyph here on some other setups. So for example, Rake can run Bane as well. That actually works with the Balazan dot. So you don't really need a cooldown reduction here. But for the builds that do, like the Quill and all the others, you run Wildfire. And this has this lucky hit effect to get a cooldown. And we also have this fire bonus here that we can convert into poison, thanks to the season power with the infusion here from Corrosive Vapor. And lastly, there's Hubris. So this is a very nice Thorns glyph. Also has, very efficient pathing, and then you get extra Thorns. This secondary bonus, we don't really max it out. And there is an argument, for example, to run counter attack to get to 100% dodge, to then get the 3000 Thorns here. So maybe especially early on, if you just can't find a razor blade or something like that, you can definitely try to slot in counter attack just to get a lot of flat Thorns. But once you have a decent razor blade, you have a lot of flat Thorns already. But we still slot this in because we have some dodge no matter what, just from existing with our dexterity, for example. And we're gonna get something like 500, 600, 700 or so, just flat Thorns here, plus decent primary and legendary effects. So you put that here. And lastly, we have the Revenge Glyph. So this is another Thorns-based power here. Also, it doesn't require a lot of points. And we have this efficient pathing here. If you want to see some of the other Paragon setups, so we have different versions here. So Paragon 200, lower level glyphs, and then, somewhere on the way. So you can also check that out. And lastly, our Horadric Jewels. So we have the Idol from below. This gives you just more damage, more stats, and perma unhindered, which is pretty neat. And it gives you sometimes extra targets. So those guys, they are pretty dangerous. But on the other hand, they also give you extra progression in the pit. And they are extra dummies to proc more Balazan and Noxus Resonance from. So you kind of want to have those, especially on boss fights. That's pretty neat. But if you are kind of bothered by them, you can also replace this gem if you want. There are some other options that are not bad. One that is also important here is Seal of Denial. So we go for 2 Denial Arcana. Then we get 30% more barrier and Thorns as well. And the interesting part here is actually that this kind of double dips on Thorns buffs. So you get 30% more flat Thorns. And you also get a 30% multi, for example, on Spiny Skin or on a Bastion, on the 20% extra multiplier here, for example. So you actually get a bit more than the 30, which is kind of neat. And lastly, we have the Myriad Stone. This is 30% attack speed in cap 1. So most of the planners here that you see will actually be somewhere in the range of 70% for cap 1. And then you get this effect as well. There is a chance that Blizzard is going to change this to cap 2 from what it sounds like, but for now this is how it works. However, this gem is changed, for example, in a pit push variant. If you have boss fights that last like 5 minutes plus or something like that, then you go for the Tyrant Bane. So this gives you a stacking permanent damage over time taken buff on the target. And in very long fights, this actually slowly ramps up. I'm not 100% sure about the mechanics of this. It ramps very slowly, so it's only really worth it for like very long fights. And this also probably makes, for example, spamming Toxic Skin a bit more valuable on those high tier bosses. But we will still have to explore this a little bit. And that's pretty much it for this video guide here. So if you want to read up more on those guides, so here, for example, here's the Balazan, Crush, Spiritborn. You can read up all of the details. So I've written the Quill and the Crushing Hand, and then we kind of base the others on that. There's Thrash, and there's also the Raid guide that you can find here on Maxroll. As always, we have the tier list. You can just press on those guides. You can check them out. And, well, I wish you good luck in the season. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you guys next time.